In this part, I'm going to go into preparation for getting your case ready for paint. If you want to see the first part and start from the beginning of this tutorial, this is part 2 of 4, and so you can find the link for that in the description below. The next step in getting your case ready to paint is prep. Now you may get a case that's like a secondhand case, like this little guy I found. I left it gray, I didn't paint it. I still washed it with soapy warm water because I was going to put decals on it, and I wanted the decals to have the best chance of sticking. And I didn't know what conditions this had been in, how many times it had been touched. But even a brand new case, especially a brand new case, you've got to wash it. I take these and I wash them because I've used a lot of cast resin objects, and they're often released from their mold with a sort of silicone mold releaser, which helps the manufacturer pop it out. I'm not 100% certain that these types of bins have a mold releaser, but it seems like they do because they have almost a slick, oily feeling sometimes on the inside of a brand new bin. And when I haven't washed them, I've had issues, and when I have washed them, I've had a lot fewer issues. So I start out by hosing it off in the driveway if it's really big, or washing in the shower if it's small. I just use warm water and a scrub brush and dish soap, and I lather it up and I scrub it and I lather it and I scrub it, and I hose it off and let it dry, and that should give you the best chance of an optimal paint adhesion. The next thing I will do is I want to keep these bins sort of in universe looking and not something as identifiable, especially not with any English writing on there. So I will take tools and I will go through and cut like all the logos off. Like I'll use a woodworking gouge to try and carve off the giant letters on a plastic bin, or I will, find a way to cover up those spots if they're really hard to cover. But often I'll do a combination of the two. I will carve off the logo, sand down the logo. You can use a Dremel with a sanding drum. You can do a lot of different things, but just to get that logo flat enough that you can later cover it with a plastic plate. Or sometimes I'll even use metal or something else that will look really good and be easy to paint, that can cover up that kind of lettering. Next, I'll go around with like an X-Acto blade and carve off any like little plastic things like from the sprue, which is where they cast it. Like on this bin, see this kind of like flappy plastic stuff? That stuff doesn't paint well, and you can usually just carve it right off. And I'll go through and carve off anything that has letters or numbers on the bottom from when they cast it. I then take off all the handles and latches, anything that you can pop off that will make it easier to paint behind them. Sometimes I paint those latches a different color anyway, or like in this one I left it gray, so I popped that out and got rid of that piece and popped off these latches so I could paint all around that area. And set those aside to paint separately if you want. I will sometimes go and give it some physical weathering, which is where I take like gouges, anything I want to remain the same color as what's on top. So I'll go through and gouge spots and nick spots that would still be white if it was a white bin, for instance. Or I'll take like a torch and lightly like warm stuff and make dents, by heating it and pressing an object into it, stuff that I want it to remain in the body of the object. I'll go through and do at this stage. And finally, I'll go through and take tape and tape off any areas I know I'm going to put something that I don't want any paint on. So here's some examples of that. The next piece of prep is to tape off anything that can't be removed that you really don't want to paint. For instance, on the big Husky bin, there's a slide out handle with a foam grip. I pull out that handle and tape it all off with paper and tape and slide it back in. I tape off the wheels on anything that has wheels. I try and cover them so that it doesn't get primered in any way and it stays black and rubber, whatever it originally was. Anything you can do to get it ready so that the only thing left to be painted is what's going to be hit with that primer. I would then go ahead and drill all the holes I know I need, if possible, or cut out rectangles where there's going to be panels or greeblies of any kind. Like on this one, I went through before making it, and I drilled out this hole and this hole and this hole and this tiny hole and this tiny hole, and over here there's a really big hole. And the reason for that is if you do this after it's painted, sometimes the drill bit will catch the edge of the paint and kind of tear like a triangle of paint off. So if you can drill all those before you prime, that's really helpful. And you know, finally, you might go over and sand things. I don't do it often because it can leave sort of a texture like this bin has. But if you sand it lightly everywhere, it's going to have a much better chance at paint adhesion, especially with that primer layer. So I do it especially on cases I know are going to be tricky, but not all the time. I kind of like a chipped look on some of these, so I risked it on this batch in any bins, kind of husky style bins. But on anything I've done where it had a lot of sanding and priming, which this is, it had a much more pebbly texture on this surface, and that's one of the prep steps, is I had to really sand it to get rid of that pebbly texture. And then I used filler primer and sanded and primed and sanded and primed. So now the pebbly texture is only a few places and very light, which is fine. That's the look I was going for. But because this has been sanded heavily with a mouse sander and a hand sanding, and then primed, and then sanded and primed, like none of this paint has chipped at all because it was so well prepped. So there's definitely a place for that. If you really hate sanding, you can skip this step, but just be ready to do some fixes and repairs. And then on something like a difficult plastic like polyethylene, this takes a special level of prep, but it's fairly simple. I looked it up because sometimes farmers will paint these water barrels to be a different color. So I took the whole thing and I sanded everywhere, all over the whole thing. It had to be really well sanded on every spot. And then I cleaned it off with a really strong rubbing alcohol and like wiped and cleaned and wiped and cleaned. Something about that helps prep this surface for primer. And I did that and also got rid of all the dust from that sanding with that alcohol treatment. It was a really good thing. And there's a test you can do to make sure the primer sticks. You can't just use any primer on this. You probably could, it probably won't work as well. There are primers that are made specifically for plastic. This one I used it was like a fusion primer, plastic primer, and it says, you know, it's for plastics on the label, and it even shows like, you know, playground equipment and chairs and things like that. It even says on that label, like, may not work with polyethylene plastic because it's such a hard plastic to paint sometimes, but it did. It worked on this one because I had done that prep. Maybe it doesn't work if you don't sand and stuff like that, and people get upset, so they put that warning on the label, but it worked on this. The final test of your primer on polyethylene is to do a grid test. So you score kind of 4x4 lines, like a little grid. So you have a little checkerboard of cuts with an X-Acto knife. And then you put a piece of duct tape on that spot and you burnish it down and you yank. And if a bunch of squares come onto the tape, you got to sand it some more and prep it some more. But luckily for this one, it worked. That one set of steps, like that one treatment totally did its job. So the grid test worked. That meant my primer worked. That's after the primer cures, of course. You can't just do it the minute you paint it. But it had worked, and so that meant every layer on top has worked, and it's had minimal chipping, except for it's hit really hard stuff sometimes. It leaves a little bit of a chip, but that worked. You know, I cut these holes, like for these lights, before I primed it, just so that it wouldn't tear on the paint. So anything that you can do before the primer stage, go ahead and do. One other thing you need to plan for, before you start priming and painting, is what you're going to add to the bin, the case, to make it different. And those are often things like greeblies. Greeblies are those little things that you add that kind of imply functionality. They can be lights, they can be knobs, they can be also writing. You have to kind of plan if you're going to add decals or not, or where you're going to add those things. I think about that stuff before I start to paint. The roof has some of them on there. I have kind of vents and you know, little knobs and little things on there. This is a belt, an extra belt piece from my Stormtrooper kit that goes around the waist, and I just added it to this because I had an extra one, and underneath here is where the writing is, so it served kind of both those functions. But I planned for it, and I cut these holes before I primed for these vents, because they're actually real vent holes with mesh behind them, so it actually helps it air out the armor between wearing it. But you plan for it. I didn't plan for this one. I'll go over that later. That's a cover up from a paint spot that went bad. But mostly I play in my spots and I take my pieces and I hold them and check them and see how they'll fit. And I found that these fit really well in this little nook. You know, you just try and like see what you have that works. And I keep bins of them. These are like my plastic and metal ones. And some of these are pieces I've gotten, you know, from like eBay, like hard drive motors. Smuggler's Room taught me that one. They love using those. Some are like stereo knobs, like old vintage stereo knobs. And then any other kind of thing I found that I thought one day that'll go somewhere. Hopefully I get to use them. Some are laser cut vents, parts of flashlights and pens. You know, just things I've found here and there that just seemed like lamp parts that look like they might work somewhere. Especially things that have threading on them so I can bolt them from the outside instead of just gluing them when it comes to metal. But something I want to say about greeblies is there is such thing as too much. And some people try and just add them all over the place. And that's a look, but very few things in the world have that look. If you think about a piece of mechanical something, there's often housing on it, sometimes some places you interact, and then areas with nothing. And I always err on too much at first when I start laying it out and I'm putting them all on there. I'm like, ooh, this here and this there, and that'll look really good there. And I take a step back and I look at it and I think it's probably too much. So leave areas like this. Like if I put one here, one here, one here, that's too much. In fact, it's already probably too much. I probably went too far on this one, but I really have a big cluster of detail here, one piece over here, and then the rest is just decals and decoration. The same can be said for writing. Like you can add too much writing, and real world things rarely have writing all over them unless it's like an advertisement of some kind. So I put a big Imperial cog, I put my TKID, my Stormtrooper number on there, and that's repeated in a couple places, and that's it. This kind of greebly, this was a fun one. I'd saved these for a few years, so I found them. They're like the lid to diaper wipes from when my kid was born, and I just took this piece, the backside where it's glued, and used it as a frame on this little light panel. So you got to like save things that seem like they might have a use one day. I also buy a lot of like resin, you know, printed ones like online. These ones come from a guy on Etsy also. So there are places you can buy them. You can 3D model them and print them yourself if you have a printer. I've done that as well for custom spots that really need them. But really you want to like find a place that it makes sense for them to go and try to reel it back and not put too many. That's my advice on greeblies. There's like just the right amount, and it's hard to describe what that is, but hopefully you know it when you see it. And I've been guilty of putting way too much stuff on these before, and every time I make one I try and pull it back a little bit. So like this is my latest batch. I made a few of these bins. I have one greebly on top with a switch. This is one I custom made just to fit this spot between those two bands. I have a piece of writing. I have one greebly on one side, but not on both sides. And then I have a single one on the kind of opposite back corner over there. And this is just a paint cover up that went bad, but you know, it's really only got 3 greeblies technically, which is a lot for a small case, but I tried to do it asymmetrically and sparse, and try and make it, you know, without going over the top and gluing stuff everywhere. Also consider like what the case is supposed to be. Like, what is the story behind the case? This is a Stormtrooper bin, so I wanted some kind of tech, not that it was full of Stormtrooper armor, but that it seemed like some kind of Imperial machine thing of something, like a piece of equipment or housed some equipment, and it had some kind of data going on the outside. So that's the story here. It doesn't have to have a full story, but think about like what makes sense, especially with the costume. So I added that Stormtrooper thing because it makes sense for a Stormtrooper to have that. That wouldn't make sense on any other bin because it's really specific to that costume. The colors specific to that costume, the decals specific to that costume. You know, it says like Imperial property on top, like that kind of thing. Like trying to think of like what this was and where it goes, help dictate what kind of look and feel. And I also match the greeblies. So I have these ones all made by Jettisonable. I have 5 of them on this thing, so they all match. They all seem like they're probably manufactured in the same place. Like that helps the overall look. Like all the knobs are similar. And I used a blue button and a white button because a Stormtrooper has like a couple blue buttons on their thing. And so that's the only splash of color in here because a Stormtrooper only has that much. And I made some of these kind of vents that are the same shape as like a TIE Fighter wing. And they also show up all over the corridors of the Death Star, that kind of stretched out hexagon. So that shape I did for an Imperial look to try and give it something that matched that culture. So this case, this is the most recent one I built. This is for my Resistance pilot. And I had some greeblies set I've been saving for a while and I just couldn't find the right thing. And it was this kind of tube greebly system. And there are these kind of tube mounts and I have them kind of all over and they go to different spots. And I thought of using it on my clone trooper at first, and it just didn't make sense for a clone. Like, tubes are neat, they can be added to anything, but it just didn't feel right. And when I made this pilot, I realized pilots have a tube. They have like a chest box with a breathing tube. TIE pilots have tubes. It's kind of a pilot thing, and so that is where it made sense to add this kind of tubing system to this case, because it just makes sense for a pilot to have that. So you got to think of like what would go well with that character. Some things just look great on everything, so don't feel like it's too limiting. But if you have something really specific, you know, try and add it to that. And like the lights, the pilot has a white and a blue light on their chest box, and so that's why I went with white and blue lights. You know, the colors all match. Some of the other things just kind of feel like pilot parts to me, like those switches, like on a classic X-Wing chest box. You know, that made sense to make those on this costume. So just try and, like, if you have a really cool greebly and a costume that goes with it, do that. There is a temptation to put way too much writing on stuff, especially in Arabesh. You know, it's a cool looking language. You see it here and there, but I think, like, as a guide, you should really look at how Galaxy's Edge does it. There is writing all over the place, but it's done in some spots. It'll be like a few characters. It'll be like a G7 on a thing, on a box, in the corner of a panel, and nothing else. They don't put like writing across an entire electrical panel all over the place, because they just don't do that. We don't do that in our world that often either. Like, sometimes, but rarely. Usually it's just like a single thing, you know, like in one corner or one area. On the top of this, I originally had made like all this writing on here, and I ended up messing up that mask, which you'll see later, but I ended up changing it to just this kind of onion slicer thing that's on pilot helmets. It looks better. So I have right on the top the name of my the group, the pilot group, and my call sign is just in some little tiny letters up here, and that's it. And it actually looks a lot better than my initial design. So, you know, if people want to put writing all over everything, I get it. The language looks cool, but putting it in a few key spots is always going to look better. A note on fasteners. It's not 100% rule, but it's like a 96, 98% rule that there are no Phillips screws in Star Wars. You can always find the exception to the rule, but if you want it to look like Star Wars, it really helps to not use Phillips screws. Phillips screws are what we see everywhere with the little plus on them. They're on everything we deal with. They're much easier to use with a screwdriver is why. They're a modern screw, and something about not using those just makes it look a little more timeless. So most of what Star Wars has are like, you know, flathead screws, and they do have just kind of an old look. I mean, this is actually an old screw, but even a modern like Allen wrench screw or something will have a better look than a Phillips one. So I actually collect these separately. Like, when I sort my screws, I put the Phillips in the Phillips area and the flatheads in another one, just because I know these are all for Star Wars. You can go buy them, like they sell them modernly, and it's kind of expensive to buy flathead screws on their own, but if you need them for something specific, definitely use it. Like, these are all flathead screws. Everywhere I have them, they're either flathead screws, or I'll sometimes buy a kit of these where these are like metric, and they all are like little Allen wrench screws, because they just look better for everything. And I use these little tiny guys because they're 1/8 inch on lots of stuff to hold like lots of things on. So these are all held on with those, reinforced with those. They hold on stuff on the inside. I use these specific ones all over, but anywhere I can, you know, especially if I find like a really cool old like knurled something that would look like a greebly almost on its own, it goes in that little tray. So I get these either from hardware stores or often like from garage sales or estate sales. I look for where somebody has like a whole bunch of tools at a garage sale, and I look for that jar of like old screws and bolts and nuts, and I buy that for $1, and I bring it here and I sort it all out, and I get more and more screws for Star Wars. So, you know, you can use Phillips screws and it will just not quite look like Star Wars. It's often kind of hard to find 2 or 4 of the same when I'm buying them in those weird little collections, so I often have to take a trip to the hardware store to find them. But if you can find like a weird head on something, it'll just look even more otherworldly. That's the way to go. I mentioned before cover-ups, where you carve off a logo, like on this one. I carved off the logo and I put this plastic plate over that top spot so that it would cover it up. I sometimes like to cover up any little areas like sprues and other things, you know, with like some kind of bolt or something like that. Most injection molded things have these little marks from where it was injection molded in the, it would be a sprue on some things, but the machine pushes the part out and leaves that kind of melted little spot. And I always think it looks just a little bit rough, so I usually just drill it out and put a little spot of glue in there, and if I'm using a rivet, I glue it. If it's a screw, I screw it in, or a bolt. I have a bunch of these little rivets. I've gotten a bunch of these bins over the years of loose aluminum rivets from garage sales and stuff, but you can use a screw, anything, and I just pop it in there. And to me, it just gives it kind of a nice finished look. I do this before weathering so I can get a little dirt around it. So instead of like a kind of rough plasticky thing that doesn't really hold paint, get a nice, even looking, intentional part. On these, they have a spoked wheel, and I take the top of like a wire spool and slice it off. I just found it happened to be the exact right size for these, and screw them on and paint them, you know, to really give it just a slightly different look. On this was a flower pot kind of base coaster thing, and so there was writing all over both sides of this, and I realized it was going to be kind of hard to sand and really get smooth because it was all this raised writing. So I cut 2 kind of partial circle pieces and stuck them on there, and that covered up all the writing. There was no writing down here, so I just did that, and then, you know, I was able to incorporate that into the design to leave a gap for my electronics. It just worked out. So covering up things to give them you know, a look like is a really good thing. Also, you can use objects to break up a design. So the bottom of this was kind of simple. I found these kind of wire outlets from Home Depot and carved the sides down, but they're meant to go on a wall where a bunch of cables go up to a TV and then come out and plug in. I just used 3 of those and made kind of vents. So you can use kind of objects to break up the form of something to make it less obviously a flower pot. Doesn't really look like a flower pot anymore. You can use like shapes to make things work. This isn't really a cover up, but I needed this thing to be flush, so I had to have a piece below and above to get it over the lip of the edge. And I made that slightly angled and slightly interesting to look a little bit more stormtroopery. Like here's another, I made them slightly angled to match the hinge shape to make it so that the hinge ended up flush on the back. So, you know, look for ways to take an everyday object. This is tapered, so kind of everything in here is now tapered over the whole thing. You know, use a shape motif when you're making cover-ups if necessary, if it makes sense to like unify a piece across everything and cover up things in a creative way. I mean, you can sand it off, you can sand it smooth and fill it and make it like it's not there, but it's often easier and more interesting to give it a little shape, like a hexagon on top or something that makes sense with that object. On this case, I solved the kind of ruler mark by getting some aluminum door thresholds that happen to be the right width. It took a while to figure this piece out, but they're actually these pretty bulky aluminum thresholds that go right below a door, and I painted them. I added these end pieces after I cut them to size and screwed them in, so that filled that kind of area, and I was able to paint them separately and drop them in, which was also nice to not have to tape them off. And they're tough, so whatever you're covering things with, you know, you got to make sure it can handle other bins being on top. At least in my shop, there's not enough room for them to all be on the floor. So aluminum threshold that chips down to metal, it's a great solution. All of these greeblies and little objects and things that you add to the outside there's a pretty good chance they're going to get bumped into hard at some point. Now, if it's on the top, for sure. I try and avoid too many things on the top because I often stack these cases up and anything on the top is going to get rubbed on by another bin. So you have to make it something strong or low profile or sunk down in some way. An exception, like these are sunk down, no problem. But an exception is this little guy. And it was a pretty stout, solid resin greebly, but instead of just gluing it on and assuming that was going to work, I drilled a hole from the back and I put a screw through the thick plastic and then into that greebly. And I put glue, like super glue, on that screw as I screwed it in so that it was not going to unwind and come off. It still will get hit. It has a little raised area next to it, but just to be sure, I do that, and I do that everywhere. So anytime I can, like these have two little bolts. This switch has a screw from the back into the switch. Everything I can bolt, I do. You know, like this little greebly, I thought it stuck out a little bit. It's held with a bolt through to the back. Bolted on these plates, bolted on, bolt, bolt. Anything I can do to really help it stay attached when it's bumped around or dinged will make it a lot better. And any chance, like everything I make has that, unless it's so small that it doesn't really matter. This is called the universal greebly. It's so tiny, it's in a recess. I just glued that on. These little guys are glued on, but anything I can bolt on, I do. So you can trust glue only so far, but if you're bumping into stuff, rolling through doorways, letting somebody else move your bin while you're out trooping, and stacking ones on top of your bin without asking, like, it's gonna happen. So engineer it with the thought that it needs help. These metal strips are glued on, but they also have screws into that plastic all over so that if I slide another bin on top, those things won't suddenly break off. So over engineer it is what I always do. If you can only pin it, like there's nowhere to bolt it, I'll drill a hole and put like a little threaded rod in there with a little bit of glue just to give it something else to hold on to it. You know, if it doesn't have threading to like screw something in, I'll insert a threaded insert like into a knob and bolt from the back with a little bit of glue so that the knob now is permanently attached and can twist and turn, but it won't come off. You know, anything you can do to help that glue. So on this one, even though I had a screw from the back, I also will drill in a few spots around there so that when I glue it, the glue falls through that drill hole and bonds with that plastic a lot better. I also do, as I said before, I'll tape off a spot. So this one was taped off so that when I went to glue this, it was gluing it to the raw plastic rather than to layers of paint, because that paint will just come off. So glue straight to plastic, drill holes to really give you a chance to glue into there, and then add a screw or a bolt just to be sure. If I'm using bolts, almost all the bolts on here either have like a lock nut, which has a nylon insert that makes it really hard to unscrew a nut. It won't unscrew on its own. Or I use something like Loctite, which is just, it's like a little blue or red. There's two different kinds. One's more removable than the other one, but this one you can put around the threads and screw it into a bolt, and it will sort of make it a lock screw temporarily until you undo it the next time. So that's one option. But my go-to thing is just to put a dot of super glue on the bolt, on the nut on the back. So if I have a little tiny nut, instead of using a little tiny lock nut, because those are more expensive, I'll often just put a dot of super glue so that it doesn't want to untwist itself with just vibration and movement. It won't just slowly work itself off. It should just stay for years and years. This tutorial ended up being really long once I edited it together, so I broke it up into 4 parts. So to see the next part, look for a link in the description below, and let's continue building.